All right, so if you open up Unity and go into the scriptable objects folder, that's where all the magic is. This is all the different types of shit that's in here. That's just a little helper. A lot of these are basically enums that I just wanted to be able to add more to later. So if we see a card has multiple things that can trigger it. So we have this card trigger in here. And the code for all these is in the root folder. So like if we go to card trigger, there's not really anything in there other than a name. When you add this create asset menu meta tag, it lets you in the editor go and create one of these. So all these are sort of branched into the types of things that they are. So for triggers, there's only a couple of base triggers, but then I have a distance target trigger and an ordinal distance trigger. So if we go look at the trigger types, wait, those are targets. Sorry, triggers. Triggers, they're just basically events, like in Flash or whatever. They just have a name. So like on attack, I have the inspector locked. So like this description is the description that shows up on the card here, and that's pretty much all the data that's on here right now. So on attack, after you attack somebody, on death, after you pick up mana or data off the board, on death is mostly going to be used for enemies after they die. On defend, after you get attacked by something. On draw, after you draw a card, which is where most of the like base stats get applied. On end move. On kill, after you kill an enemy. On receive support, that's when an ally moves through you, which is only going to be enemies are going to be able to do that. And on support is when you move through an ally, which only enemies are going to be able to do that. So that is a trigger. That's this part of the card. When a trigger happens, an effect will spawn. So an effect is actually sort of the most complicated part that took a while to figure out. An effect is made up of a target, a trigger, a target, and an action is what I ended up calling them. So a target, if we look at my target classes, we've got a card target, which is just the base target. That's sort of like for anything that is super generic. Card target. So I just got a couple flags in here for like, do I target friends? Do I target enemies? Do I target the board? Do I target myself? And then I have a card target distance, which is just, target all whatever's within X units. So like within 2 spaces, within 1 space, within 3 spaces. This is for like bomb style, Nova style effects. And this inherits from target. So this also has all these same flags. And then ordinal distance is for things like the dagger and arrow effects. So like get me the nearest enemy or the nearest friend or the 2 nearest enemies. So value here is like how many to get. And so if we look at the actual targets that I made, we have, all enemies, closest enemy, closest 2 enemies, enemy single target. This is the trigger that will be applied when you attack somebody. So I don't know that there's going to be any effects that come out of that, but it just seemed like a valid target, so I went ahead and made it anyway. I haven't actually used that one yet. Enemy within 1 is all enemies within 1 space of you, which is essentially like right next to you, within 2, within 3. All friends, closest 2 friends. I added a separate ones for friend plus self, which are the same thing, but include yourself in case I wanted to do some sort of like healing aura or attack buff aura that also hit the person that was casting it. And all these friend ones are going to be for enemies to use on each other. Friend within 1, friend within 2, friend within 3. Some things can target the game board. So like when you have an effect that spawns data, that gets targeted to the game board. And then the vast majority of effects get targeted to self. So self in most occasions is going to be the player, but if the card is on an enemy, the enemy will target itself. Okay, so these are targets, and then these are actions. So an action, there's sort of a base class for just sort of a generic action. And then this one is actually not, I don't think any of these are used. The three primary actions are draw a card, which is just how many cards do I want to draw. Spawn data, which is how much data do I want to spawn. Those could have been the same, I guess, but it made sense to have them separate to me, so I did. The vast majority of all things can be encompassed by this card action modify stat by value, which says, hey, what stat do I want to modify? Hey, how do I want to modify it? And what is the value? So I had to create a couple of like little helpers for this one. So character stat, if we go into our character stat here, attack, the easy ones are attack, health, speed. Those are like just your how much health do you have, how much speed do you have, how much attack do you have. Burst is like a stat that I just added, which is like your next hit. So burst sticks on your character. So if you have 5 bursts, the next time you hit somebody, you're going to deal +5 damage, and then that burst is going to go away. So that's good for like sneak attack or like, you know, warrior enrage type things. There's counterattack, which is your chance to hit back if somebody hits you. Critical hit, which is your chance to do like a 2 or 3x modifier. Dodge, chance to dodge an attack. And stun, chance to stun an enemy. I changed how all those work, but I haven't wired any of that up, so it's kind of pointless. Basically, these are just the stats that can be applied with effects. And the value modifiers are static amount is just the like you know, attack +1, attack +3. Currently held data is +1 per currently held data, or really it's +X. So it's like it could have a value of 1 or 2. Like you could have an effect that is like +2 attack per currently held mana, and it would just have be a currently held data value modifier. So let me go into these. ×2, you know, number of enemies is a value that is the number of enemies on the board. So these two will be dynamically computed at runtime when the thing is triggered, and then this one is however much is coded onto the card. So that brings us to the meat of the cards, which is the card effects themselves. And it ended up sort of like making these super generic, which was great because instead of having like one effect that is like attack +1, speed +1, you just would add both of those effects onto a single card instead of having like basically the effect be the proxy. And I created like half the cards doing it that way, and then I realized like how much more work that was. So then I deleted them all and start over. So the naming scheme on here is essentially what is the trigger? So what triggers that? And that's represented in this trigger column. And because all this stuff is Unity like first class objects, so like if I wanted to make a new trigger, so like let's say I was making this one from scratch, I would just do create card, create trigger, and let's call it on attack. Self attack +4 or something, whatever. So like, oh, sorry, this is a trigger. I don't want a trigger. Delete that. I want an effect. Character cards. Create an effect. We'll call that on attack self attack +4. So this is saying, because this is a first class object, you can search for them just like you would anything in Unity. So like, what trigger do I want? And then I just go down and find my triggers. All right, I want this one to trigger on attack. Okay, who do I want to be targeted by this? I want this to happen to me. Okay, and then what action do I want to happen? So I browse through all my actions I made. I didn't go through the actions. So these are the actual actions that are created from those action models. So like simple like static amount attack +1 is just an effect that is attack +1. This one is a attack +1 per data. This one is an attack +1 per enemy, and so forth for all those stats I went through. Like spawn data is a special type of action. Draw card is a special type of action. That is this guy up here. The rest are all just different value modifiers of this card action modify stat by value. All right, back to our effect. We can, so we've got what triggers it, we've got who it targets, and then we need to put an action on it, and it'll just be attack +4. And I could go in and make as many of these as I want to. These are just, I made a bunch of them that would cover all the possible cards that I already made. Cool, that's a cool card effect. Delete that because I don't actually want it. So here's some of the card effects. And so with these, however many this is, 25 or so effects, I was actually able to build out every single card except for one in that spreadsheet. So let's go to card models is the meat of it. So if you just want to like dick around and see what the cards are in here, you just click on this test card and lock it, and then you can just drag a card on here. I changed the bard to monk because monk made more sense for sort of healing and zen powering up based on the number of enemies. So a single card, let's find a good one. A card is made up of a card name. So my naming scheme here is essentially like, what class is it? How much does it cost to buy it in the store? And then what is the name of the card? And that way I can just sort of at a glance see how many of each type I have. My next thing is actually going to build like a view that has a little bit of analytics into all this. Go back to a good one. So like here's a good one that this is like the monk's cantrip. So it's named Center Yourself. It's for the monk. I have a card type, which is sort of like a, who does this belong to? And I'm using that to tint the background just so they have a little bit of visual variety. Go back to the card. Let's lock this. So we got a monk. There are 5 effects on this card. So this is a, when drawn, give yourself +1 attack, +1 speed, and spawn 1 data on the board. Also heal yourself 1 and draw a card. And I can change those effects to be whatever I want. So like another interesting one is, like some of the mage ones are pretty interesting, or the rogue ones. Let's go to rogue. The double bow shot is expressed as, it's called double arrow. It costs 7. There's one of them in the purchase pool. It's for rogues. It has 3 effects. So when you draw it, you give yourself attack +2, speed +2, and then at the end of your move, the 2 closest enemies will lose 4 health. I haven't figured out how exactly I'm going to bridge this data to the actual game world, but this is the intent of it. So now I'm going to be starting the world part pretty soon. So if we drag that one on, that, let's put the double arrow in there, and we can preview what it does. When drawn, +2 attack, +2 speed, end of move, -4 health to the closest 2 enemies. So the way that this is wired up now is every single one of these card actions has a, if I go to one of these actions, has a, sorry, not an action, the card effects have copy on them. So the description is -1 attack, description is -1 speed to all enemies, +1 health, so on and so forth. And so what happens is, since a card is made of multiple effects, it groups all the effects for a single trigger into one and just separates them with commas. If it starts with a lowercase letter, it'll uppercase it. I should probably put a period at the end. And then the second effect it finds, it puts into this one. So if it's a card that only has one effect, or one type of effect, like just a simple model starter card, everything will go in here, and then all these will just blank out. Just as a design rule for now, A, because it made doing this little UI mockup quicker, and B, because it kind of makes sense, I think cards should be limited to only 2 triggers. So like a card shouldn't have too much complexity. Like it can do a bunch of stuff in one. Like some of these actually do quite a bit. But I don't think you should have 3 triggers on one. I mean, that's a rule that could be broken later. Right now, it's purely for convenience. But it seems like an okay rule to have. So now I have a pretty good way to create and preview cards, and I just have to start wiring up the actual game world to dispatch these triggers and then respond to these actions. But if we wanted to make more cards, it's going to be super easy. So one of the next things I'm going to do is actually make a scene that has a little bit of diagnostics of like, okay, here's how many mage cards there are. Okay, here's how many monk cards there are. How many rogue, how many warrior, and which effects are currently being used and not used very much. Like, since I added a couple of new effects, like how I wanted attack and burst and counterattack, like there's really only one card each for burst, counter, crit, dodge, these sort of special +1 per data. And I feel like those are a lot more interesting than the static ones. So I think one of the next tasks is going to be to like just make a bunch more cards that flesh out some of those mechanics a little better, or even come up with new mechanics, which is easy to do because none of this is like code. All of this is just data for now. But this gives me like 50-something cards, 55 cards to start prototyping with.